Hey guys, welcome to Coronavirus Earth Science. We're on weather day 14, which is air masses. Just a reminder, we are checking out our grades that are going to be checked on this Saturday. We have the weather station's model lab, and don't forget that this one is being collected via Schoology. Okay, so you must submit it on Schoology in order to get credit. If you have any extenuating circumstances where you can't do it on that, email it to me. And then you also have your Google Form summary quiz number 4, which does count as a quiz, so please make sure that you get it done. Okay, so again, here is our aim. How do air masses differ? Our do now, winds get their names based on where they come from, right? So if you have a wind coming from the west, it is called a western wind, even though it's blowing towards the east. At the end of today, you're going to have a little worksheet I want you to get done. And then obviously we know that these are the two things that you are getting your big grades on. Okay, so how do we define air masses? Basically, it's a mass is like a chunk, right? So it's this chunk of air, this piece of air that has characteristics based on where it came from. All right, so wherever that air formed over, it's going to have the same characteristics of that location. Okay, so it's called its source region. All right, so if you have air that formed over Florida, right? Florida is known for being really warm and for being really humid, meaning that there's a lot of moisture in the air, right? So that means that that air mass that formed over Florida is going to have warm, moist air. And if that air mass blows up towards New York, we're going to also get that warm, moist air that came from Florida. All right, so it's that air mass is going to have the same characteristics of where it formed. And usually when we talk about that source region, that air mass, you have to talk about temperature and you have to talk about moisture. So words would be like warm versus cold, or it would be wet versus dry, or humid versus dry, right? Okay, so these are the words that we are going to be going over. So the first thing we have is this, continental versus maritime, and then these, tropical, polar, and Arctic. Continental versus maritime, this is going to be talking about whether it's dry or if it's humid. Tropical, polar, and Arctic are going to be talking about its temperatures. So take a look right here in this column. I want to know what specifically are those words talking about. All right, so let's go through to make sure we know what every single word means. So continental, the word continent is in it, right? So that means that it formed over land. Its symbol is going to be a C. If it formed over land, that is going to reference if it's going to be dry or humid, right? Is it going to be dry, or is there going to be a lot of moisture in it if it formed over land? Well, it should be dry. We're talking about humidity here. All right, so continental and maritime are going to be the ones that talk about humidity. Is it dry or is it moist? So maritime means water, right? So if it forms over water, the symbol is going to be an M. We're talking humidity still, right? And if it forms over water, there's going to be a lot of moisture in the air. So if you see an air mass and it starts with continental, then you're going to know that it's dry air. If it starts with the maritime, then you're going to know it's wet air. Okay? Now we're going to start talking about temperature. And these are all words that you guys know, right? Tropical means warm, polar means cold, and Arctic means very cold. All right, so your lower latitudes, these are places closer to the equator, right? Closer to zero. That's why they're lower latitudes. The symbol is going to be a T for tropical. We're talking temperature now, and tropical means warm, right? Then you have polar, which is going to be higher latitudes, right? Now you're moving up, you're moving farther away from the equator. P is your symbol. We're still talking temperature, and now it's a little bit colder, right? And then Arctic is at the poles, right? You're super cold, okay? So whenever we talk about an air mass, you always have to mention these two things. You have to mention one thing about the humidity and one thing about the temperature. Okay, so take a look. I'm going to give you one at a time. So here are the different air masses that you need to know. Okay, the first letter is always going to talk about the humidity. So it's either going to be continental or maritime. And then the second letter is going to be talking about your temperature. So those are the words that we just went over on the previous slide, right? It's either going to be tropical, polar, or Arctic. All right, so let's go through each one. So this one is CA, which is continental Arctic. If it's continental, that means that it formed over land, so it's dry. And if it's Arctic, that means that it's very, very cold. So that means it's close to the poles, okay? Places that are very cold. The next one is CP, continental polar. Continental means over land, so it's dry, and polar means that it's cold. So it's going to be northern latitudes, right? Somewhere like Canada, right? And it's land still, so it's dry. Continental tropical is the next one. Over land, so it's dry, and tropical meaning that it's warm, so it must be closer to the equator. So warm land areas. Next one is MT, which is maritime tropical. Maritime means that it formed over the ocean, so it's going to be wet, and tropical means that it's warm. So warm waters. So Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, right? These are good examples. And then the last one is maritime polar. So it's water, right? It formed over water, so it's going to be moist, and it's cold. Cold waters, cold oceans. So the North Atlantic Ocean or the Northern Pacific Ocean. So aside from knowing what characteristics those air masses have, you should be able to identify where they form. All right? And again, make sure that you pay attention to land versus sea. All right? That's going to determine if it's continental or maritime. And then you also have to pay attention to its latitude to get temperatures. All right, so if you look at number one is over land, and it's really, really high up towards the poles. So that's going to be land, continental, really, really high up, Arctic. Continental Arctic. Number two, that's Canada. It's land, and it's still higher up. So that's going to be continental polar. Number three, ocean. So it's going to be wet, so that's maritime. And that's a northern ocean, so it's going to be cooler. So that's maritime polar, right? Cold oceans. Four is the same thing, a colder ocean, right? So it doesn't matter if it's the Atlantic or the Pacific. If it's cold ocean, it's still going to be maritime polar. Number five, now we're down south. Now we're closer to the equator, and it's over the ocean. So it's going to be maritime tropical, warm ocean. Number six, land. So it's continental, and it's warmer. So it's warm land, dry and warm. Continental tropical. And then seven, warm water, maritime tropical. So this is the Gulf of Mexico. This is where you get a lot of questions about. All right, they like to ask you questions about this, and they like to ask you questions about these, continental polar. Those are two common ones that you're probably going to see on your CASA learnings. Okay, so summary. The properties of an air mass depend mainly on where they formed over, right? Good. If they form over water, then they're going to be wet, right? And if they formed closer to the North Pole, it's going to be cold versus the equator, which is where it would be warm. This one, locations A and B on the map of North America below are source regions for air masses. Compared to the air mass formed at location B, the air mass formed at A will be, all right, so B is going to be continental polar, because that's like Canada area. And then A is the Gulf of Mexico, maritime tropical. So location A will be warmer and wetter. Okay? An air mass originating over the northern Pacific Ocean. North Pacific means that it's cold. Ocean means that it's wet. So cold oceans. Maritime polar. All right? You should try to complete this worksheet, day 14 air masses, as a summary. Okay? Should be pretty simple. If you did your notes, it should go hand in hand with it. All right. Have a great day. Don't forget to do your lab and your weather summary on Google Forms.